Welcome to the webinar. Today's webinar is going to be, one moment. Left a speaker on. Today's webinar is Designing Participatory Movements with Huang and Alessandra Orofino, both of whom are founding members, or some of the founding members at Purpose, and they can talk to you more about their work as they describe this, but we just have a few housekeeping things we want to go over. They're going to present, and then at the end we'll be taking questions. If you'd like to tweet about the webinar, we're using the hashtag D4SI, or our Twitter name is either @SVADSI or Lishan's is @Lishan. For anyone who'd like to follow us on other social media, we are on Facebook and LinkedIn, and you can find us by searching DSI-MFA. One last thing that we wanted to bring up is that we have a scholarship prize right now. It's called the Buffalo Prize, and it is for a young woman in Buffalo, or who has a connection to Buffalo, to come do the program. The master's program is a 2-year program, and afterwards she will be connected with Buffalo and will have a job in either community development or urban revitalization working in Buffalo. So on that note, I'm going to let Ali and Lishan take over.
Great.
Thank you, Erin.
Yeah, thanks for the intro, Erin. So as Erin said before, our presentation is on designing participatory movements, and we'll define that as we go along so it doesn't sound so scary with these big words. And so just to introduce ourselves briefly before we get started, I'm Lishan and this is Alessandra.
Hello.
We're faculty members here at SVA's MFA Design for Social Innovation. Our day jobs are at Purpose, as Erin said before. It's an incubator for participatory movements. So we create designs, experiences that mobilize large groups of people online for offline impact. We're headquartered here in New York, but we've just recently opened an office down in Rio, down in Brazil, where Ali is from. And we'll give a brief overview of what design means in our practice, building these participatory movements, and we'll give specific examples from our recent and ongoing work down in Brazil. So our presentation is on designing participatory movements. So we'll go through each of these words: design, participation, and movement, define what they mean to us, and then go into some more detail, and we'll bring it all together to make sense. So let's start with design, since that's the first word. So for us, design is both an applied art and a liberal art. And what we mean by that is, as an applied art, it combines creativity with enterprise. It's a form of human endeavor that's linked to technical skill, to craft, but it's also a liberal art, and by liberal art we have a pretty liberal definition of that as well. Liberal art in the classical sense of, in antiquity, liberal arts were everything that a free citizen had to study to be a citizen, right? So it's everything from literature to languages, philosophy, history, math, science, so it's everything. Cultural agents need to have knowledge of these fields if we're going to be dealing with movements and people.
Yes, and I think that speaks a lot to our personal backgrounds, the way we see design and why we became interested in design. So for me, one thing that I should establish right in the beginning is that I'm not a designer, so I hope you don't blame me for that. I have a background in economics, actually, and the reason why I was interested in economics in the first place was because economics is, in a way, the language of the game. It's a system that allows you to do a lot of things and express very complex ideas in a way that always wins, and that deeply bothered me when I was growing up, that economists would just come along and show these very complicated charts and everyone would respect them for that and not necessarily hear other people out. Going from that, I actually became more and more interested in incentive structures and how you design those and make people do things. And that's how I discovered systems thinking and design thinking. As also a way of making people do things, just like economists do, but using a different language and using a different set of tools.
Right. And I'm a designer now, but I didn't start out in design. I was actually a film school dropout. I was a songwriter who became a copywriter. I ended up graduating with a degree in political science and kind of discovered design later after working as a teacher and working at NGOs doing campaigns and communications. And when I was a kid, I think I wanted to be like a spy or a diplomat, this idea of being like a secret agent.
That is so much cooler than economist.
I think with design, it's like it's a tool for becoming a cultural agent, and this is a term that we'll go into more detail in later, but this idea of being a cultural agent where you have power to affect culture. You're both using culture as your canvas, as your lens through how you do things, but you're also changing the culture itself as a medium. So let's continue to define design. One really great definition that I like was from the Eames, Charles and Ray Eames. In 1972, there was an interview with, I think, just Charles, where he was asked by the interviewer, what is your definition of design? And he came up with this definition: a plan for arranging elements to best accomplish a particular purpose. And this is not a plug for Purpose Where We Work, it's just a word that comes up a lot. Yeah. But I think the key word here is this arranging bit, that design isn't just about decoration. It's about taking things that already exist and putting them together in a new way, creating new meanings to get something accomplished. And why is that important? Because movement making is messy, right? Because movements are made out of people, like Soylent Green, it's made out of people. And people are political, they like to argue a lot, they like to talk a lot, sometimes talking too much prevents them from actually getting stuff done, they disagree. But there's also like resilience in networks. Think about this metaphor, this example really, of getting 10 of your friends and family members together for dinner. How do you pick the restaurant? How do you pick the time? And this is really hard, right? Even coordinating a small group, let alone a large social movement around making a city better. And so, but there's also resilience in this network because they're your family and your friends. So if bad things happen, you lose your job or there's a death in the family, people come together and they're able to support each other. So there's kind of the good side and the bad side, but it's understanding these elements of networks and this messiness of people. And that's why we need to have that sort of liberal arts as opposed and applied arts background as designers to make movement making happen.
Yeah. Oftentimes it becomes about, breaking through the inertia that endless discussion can bring about and actually giving people an opportunity to take action. And the flip side of that, and what's really hard about it, is that oftentimes what that requires is that consensus may not be the most fundamental value in what you're doing. So movement making isn't necessarily about building consensus, it's about building shared vision, but not necessarily consensus about every single detail of what of the path to get there. So that's especially hard in contexts in which consensus is a highly valued thing. I think Brazil is a good example of that. If you look at Brazilian history and see how social change was brought about in Brazil, it was oftentimes by this kind of elite consensus, not necessarily by disruption. And I think that when you build a movement, you are being disruptive in many ways, and that can be difficult to do in those contexts.
So, as we see, there's tons of messages in marketing out there, and designers are kind of guilty of this, right? We make stuff all the time, all these messages, we make ads, we make all sorts of things, and people are looking for ways to participate, but how do they get through this clutter, all this noise relative to the signal, right? And participation in a movement participation is the opposite of propaganda. There's messages and marketing in abundance, but there's really a scarcity of like real meaning and motivation, and that's what gets people to really want to be involved in a movement.
Yeah, I think for Maria, the movement that we're going to tell you a little bit more about in a minute, we picked the city as our scope and our subject because we thought that people are actually finding a lot of meaning and motivation in their communities and neighborhoods and not necessarily somewhere else. So the city is a good playground for playing with motivation and meaning because it has so much emotional weight in people's lives. There's an emotional geography to how people actually circulate in those spaces and create meaning in those spaces that is really interesting and fascinating.
So back to the focusing on the role of design, kind of borrowing from the greats in design. Here with Milton Glaser, he talks about linking beauty and purpose can create a sense of communal agreement. And that communal agreement is part of a shared identity, right? And one of his famous campaigns and logos was the I Heart New York logo, which came out in the 70s, which is before our times. But from what I've read about it, it was at a time when New York was having a hard time, right? Crime was at a record high. There was urban blight in the Lower East Side that's now fashionable boutiques, and wine bars was kind of junkies and whatnot. And it's not just that this design like changed the city around, which would maybe be overstatement, but it was this common thing that people could rally around, and this shared identity of they loved New York enough that collective action could be made to make the city better. And I think that's something that we wanted to do through design with Rio as well, which is also living through this historical moment of change.
Yes.
And then going back to Eames about when he was asked by the same interviewer as the previous slide, what are the boundaries of design? He answered, what are the boundaries of problems? There was another question to that question, and this idea of expanding the boundaries of design past just making artifacts and making things, logos, and making like real meaning and motivation for people who want to get involved.
So for Maria, our problem, the problem that we picked, was how do you redesign the user interface of civic participation in Rio? And one thing that it's good to tell you, I think, is that defining the problem is actually much harder than it may seem. And it took us a long time to get to this problem. We knew when we created Rio that Rio was going through a historic shift, that it was receiving a lot of money, and there was a lot of aggressive urban change that was about to happen in the city as it prepared to host the Olympic Games and the World Cup and other international events. It also had, for the first time in many years, a political agreement between the city, the state, and the federal government that made the money flow much easier and gave municipal government the political momentum to do a lot of changes in the city. And the problem that we saw at first with that was, well, that's great, that's a great opportunity, but people are not necessarily being heard. So when you have change happening in a city very rapidly, but people who are from there and their needs and wants are not necessarily part of the conversation, that could become a problem. However, we didn't necessarily see it as a user interface problem in the way that we're putting it here at first. It took us a long time. A long time for us to get there. Just by talking to people, our first assumption was that it was fundamentally a problem of inequality to,
which is a real problem.
Which is a real problem.
But how do you address inequality?
Yeah. So, people have different access to education, different levels of access to resources in general, and we thought that was the crux of the issue. And as we started to investigate it, we realized that even in a situation of inequality, which we should obviously try to change, but even as we work to change it, inequality is not necessarily an excuse for making the political process exclusive. So for getting people out of the room when it's convenient. And we just have to build the user interfaces that just assume that there is inequality, assume that people are not going to have the same levels of understanding of the political process, and make it easier for people to participate, regardless of their level of education or access to resources.
And the
which is how we got to that. Yeah.
And the key word is feedback, right? When we design
Yes.
user interfaces, good user interfaces have feedback. And Brazil is a democracy. They actually have mandatory voting. So people show up and vote, but then you vote and then what? Right? There's like no wonder that like playing volleyball at the beach is more fun than getting involved in politics because you do something, there's consequences, or playing video games is more fun than politics. But if you vote, like what happens? Is your voice heard by politicians, or do they just kind of forget about you because they don't need your vote anymore, and then 4 years later they try to campaign to you again, and it's this idea of propaganda versus participation. So we want to create these feedback loops by bridging the gap through storytelling and different interface design elements. And then why the city, right? Besides the fact that Ali is a Carioca, she's from Rio, but Aristotle talks about the city as a platform for human happiness. And with design and technology, we talk about platforms all the time, like Facebook and Google, and they're sort of software as service, right? This thing that lives in the cloud, it does things for you, gives you value, and you can access it through a user interface. And what if the city, we thought about the city as service, and it's not just service in terms of getting your garbage picked up, having the subway run on time, but just being a part of it as a citizen, and that like your political needs for the future are being met as well, and not just kind of these basic level services, but like these kind of higher level services for you as a citizen.
I think Aristotle was thinking of Rio when he said that the city was a platform for happiness.
So let's move on to participation, and what do we mean by that? And one thing is that participation is more than a meme. So it's more than just lol cats and funny things. It's not the fact that we're making these pictures of funny cats that have weird grammar, but it's the fact that we've made them together. Clay Shirky talks about lol cats as digital folk art. And in some ways, these are participatory systems that have a protocol, they have a grammar, right? It was started by somebody, it has a story, but then now anybody can create a lolcat if you have just the basic access to pictures of cats and software and whatever. And it is a grammar that you learn, just like learning English or learning Portuguese or whatever. And it's the fact that we've created this together that's interesting. So if we can create funny cat pictures, what else can we create together?
Yeah, I think the point here is really that process can be more interesting and meaningful than the output. So the output here is pictures of funny cats, which, I love them, but it's not necessarily that piece that is the most important. Is the fact that it was done in a collaborative manner. And it's the same with policy to some extent, right? There is no reason to believe that democracy is the best way of getting things done. I think there's a lot of proof to the contrary. But democracy is important because of the process. Because even if the output isn't necessarily the best one in terms of efficiency or time effectiveness, it's still like the process by which you get to the output is really fundamental here. And I think that is exactly where Mario's intervention is. We're not necessarily dictating what public policy should be in the city. We don't care so much about the content of politics. We care a lot more about how politics is actually processed, and the process by which we formulate public policy is almost more important than the public policy itself. That's also, sorry, I'll finish in a minute. That's also something to think about when you see this new wave of channels for participation being built by powers that be. There are very interesting stuff going on in government right now around this. And one good example that you might be familiar with is the White House attempts to create this kind of petition channel inside of the White House website. You can actually petition your government in your government in a way, and it's really interesting, and I think it's a good sign.
Right, which is a user interface.
It's a user interface that they've created to allow you to participate. The problem with that, and it's just something to be conscious about, not necessarily something to be extremely critical of, is that the danger, rather, is that we're replicating, in a way, old architectures of power with those new user interfaces. So it's still government giving you this one little space for participation that they define, they design, and because they design it, they hold the power, right? And what we are trying to do with organizations like Mario and others is actually design those systems ourselves, so we actually have the power.
Right. And then it's not just like one-to-one, it's one-to-many, right? It's like the equivalent is like, in my very building here in New York, there's, if there's a problem with the management company, you can email them and do stuff, and there's even an online form, but you can't necessarily connect with your neighbors. In fact, you get in trouble if you put like leaflets under people's doors and stuff like that. So it's as if we've created this, if the user interface is just like, you can talk to the president, but if you can't really talk to each other, then it's only kind of part of the puzzle.
Yeah, it's like with unions, oftentimes, like it could be, a lot of corporations have problems with unionized workers, even though they actually have very interesting channels for dialogue with workers. So when you have a demand, like a salary demand, for instance, you can actually talk to your manager and your boss, but talking to other coworkers about that demand is what's really dangerous. So, these companies have figured out the process can be much more dangerous and interesting than output, even though the output could be the same, it could just be a salary raise. But yeah.
And participation is more than a buzzword. It's about co-creation. It's actually, a lot of people are afraid of participation, despite it being kind of this hot buzzword right now. But really, if we can think about participation as a way of mitigating risk through resilience, it's like these networks that we were talking about before with your 10 friends, right? It's hard to get them to do anything like go out to dinner, but if you really have a problem, they'll actually come together. So you can build it and they will come, but they might not come. And there's actually risks in that too. And it's like recognizing that illusion of control. Or you can just build it together with people.
So it's a way of mitigating risk from the beginning, right? You know that whatever you're doing actually reflects a real need because it was done by the people who need it.
And whoever you are, a designer, a social innovator, some sort of leader, it's kind of rethinking your role as an auteur of like, this is your grand vision of the design, to becoming an animator, and how you enable people to co-create with you, which goes to the point of sharing, which is the fact that you can't just like co-create on like this level of like, oh, I'm gonna like take from your culture and it's like really great. Or like this example in Brazil, right, of like pharmaceutical companies go to the Amazon, they learn from these native tribes about their pharmaceuticals from some plant in the rainforest, and then they try to patent it so nobody else can take it. And it's just like sort of besides the point, right? You're not just creating with people and then taking all the value, you want to kind of share back. And with us, our value is that we share stuff. So all of our source code is open source. Our content is Creative Commons. We're giving this free webinar right now.
Hopefully you're enjoying it. Yes, and there's a lot of old school kind of criticism to this model. When we started Maria, we heard a lot of questions from funders and other people who make money-related decisions around this. And they were expressing what's actually a very valid concern, which was, is it actually worth to share the code, for instance? You create this necessity of documentation. You actually have to put this code out in the world and make it available to other people, and that is burdensome. It takes some time to do that. It's not free. And our answer to them, and I'm very convinced that it was the right answer, is that even though it would take us a little extra time to document things and make them available for sharing, once you do that, you actually get all these amazing economies of cost, right? You actually get people to work on your software for free. They are improving upon what you have. And that's something that for us it continues to be really important, especially with something like software that becomes obsolete so quickly.
Yeah, exactly. So then the final point on participation is that participation starts with play, and we've kind of talked about feedback before and user interfaces and play, and gamification is kind of something that we've thought about. Some of our designs and our artifacts are about games and how can you make politics more interesting to people, but fun has a shelf life as well. It's not just about fun, because you don't always win in politics. Sometimes you lose, and that's kind of a hard lesson, but really like the feedback is more important than fun. And through play, you kind of learn stuff, you find your passion, right? Maybe somebody wasn't interested in politics before, but because there was an interesting web experience, they become interested in politics, and then they find their purpose in this movement that we're making, and then they learn about things as they go along and they do stuff.
Yes.
Yep. So the final section, the third section, is talking about movements, and what do we mean by that as people? So we said before we work at Purpose, where we create 21st century movements, and our definition of a movement is simply a community with a purpose. And with this community, we build movements that co-create shared value, like we said before, that they're participatory, and that they just get stuff done together. They drive change through action. It's not just people who come together and talk about things. It's not just about that scale, the eyeballs or the views or something, or about these memes, but that they're actually making change in the real world, which is the ultimate metric of change. And we're focusing on design tonight because that's the topic of the webinar, but we also work with people who are political strategists, behavioral economists, people who have a brand background, and people who are like ex-McKinsey refugees. And so we bring together all of these things. We arrange all of these elements, like in the Eames definition of design, to design teams that can build movements. And so because movements are communities with a purpose, we need to channel that participation. We talked before about how movements are messy because there's lots of noise in the signal. And so you have to take these communities and conversations, which are great, but they have an inertia, and channel them to make action and impact. And how do you do that? And I think I'll let Elvis make the point more eloquently with a little less conversation, a little more action. Please, I can't dance right now because I'll probably
You should dance.
No,
I'm sure people will.
I don't think the camera's set up for that. But
you can say we shall dance in another.
But participation, to sort of extend the metaphor, is getting people on the dance floor, right? And then movements are about getting them to do the line dance together or to do the conga line. It's some sort of coordinated effort is necessary. It's not just people dancing alone.
Yes, I heard about this party somewhere where people just dance through the song of their iPods, and you don't even know what people are dancing to. So that's the opposite of what we want to do.
That's like bowling alone of our decade.
Yes,
it's like dancing alone to your iPod.
Yes, indeed.
And so part of how we deal with this mess and this clutter is building commitment over time. And how do you deal with people just being overwhelmed prematurely, right? It's like a lot of us have seen these sites before, or we've had these mailings before from very well-meaning do-gooder organizations who want to say, like, donate to our cause, like us on Facebook, sign our petition, write a letter to your senator. And it's a lot to deal with at any one time. And part of it is kind of building this over time and thinking about the short term as well as the long term, and saying, like, just feed this content for now. Next week, maybe we'll ask you to join something, sign a petition. And we have this rule that's the 30-30-30 rule about designing interfaces and experiences, where people should get what they want in 30 seconds, whether it's signing the petition or getting the gist of some piece of content. But then we also have enough for 30 minutes if they want to come back, learn more about the organization, look at previous things we've done, and then thinking also about the long term of 30 years, right? With Mail Rio, our target audience is young people. And so in 30 years, they're the future leaders of Rio. So how do we build these long-term, before 30 years, and how do we build these kind of long-term relationships? It's beyond these kind of memes and these 40-character tweets. Absolutely. And so even if it is a tweet, like, how does this build this relationship over time?
And that means also building trust with your community. So making sure that people know what to expect from you. So that's what actually makes engagement possible over time. And trust is definitely like the most valuable currency in movement making.
And so we've touched upon this a little bit before. We also have to redesign leadership as we see it. And it doesn't matter if you self-identify as a designer or you're some other kind of leader, but just looking at kind of checking your ego, right? Becoming enablers for others, animators and not auteurs, and just sort of convening people and catalyzing them to do stuff. And participation is not propaganda. We've talked about these things before, but just redesigning ourselves before we try to redesign other people.
This is really tough to do if you're a politician, for instance, which is why working with politics is really complicated in this case, is that politicians often have a project for power, right? And that implies that they need authorship. They need to be able to claim things, say they did something, which is why making policy making more participatory can be really hard, because what you're doing essentially is that you're removing that level of authorship. You're saying, this is not your city to create, this is our city, we can create it together. And even though that could be easier to do, it's just much less, it's much less worthy in the eyes of a politician who's very power hungry, for instance. So how do we present that in a way that makes sense to that audience is also really important. Right. And how do we make participation in and of itself something that that politician could take pride in starting? And we work with that incentive structure that they have.
And that the participation matters in politics, that democracy isn't just sort of ceremonial and brief soapbox, right? It's like our view that there's limits to technocratic leadership. Even if you're kind of the best, you have the technical resources and you're the smartest and all of this. Even if you're building this kind of utopian city, if people weren't asked about it and they're not involved in it, we don't think it's okay, even if the streets are clean and the buses run on time.
I hope the buses one day run on time. Then we can have that discussion again. Maybe
so we'll kind of get into the meat of building this movement and what you can do as a designer. And these three elements are storytelling, protocols, and artifacts. And artifacts are just one part of it, although sometimes designers focus just on the artifacts, the things that you can touch and look at. But really the storytelling matters, and it's kind of like religion, right? The storytelling is the creation myth, or how we make sense of the world. It's the in the beginning story. And then the protocols are the thou shalts, the thou shalt nots. So the 10 commandments, we're going to use the kind of geek metaphor, it's the operating logic. It's the source code, not just of your computer, but also the social source code of the social software of how you make sense of the world. So we'll start with storytelling. So I read this article in The Atlantic the other day by Eric Liu, and he talks about why civics class should be sexy. And this is kind of he was talking about the US context and how politics is really about power, and it's not just about process and procedures. It's not enough to just learn about politics, whether it's learning about history, what happened in 1492, 1776, or what rights you're accorded in the Constitution, which are important to know as a citizen, but it's more important to actually exercise your power as a citizen. So rather than learning about your right to free speech, how about exercising your right to free speech in the classroom, outside of the classroom? And that's kind of what we want to do with Maria, with the internet. Tocqueville, when he came to the US 200 plus years ago, he was sort of noticing that associational life, clubs and groups were a school for the larger democracy. And for us today, the internet and Mail Rio is a kind of mini school for the larger democracy in Rio.
Yes, it's almost like learning a language, right? You can really learn a language by just reading a book. You have to speak it. So when we started Mail Rio, a lot of people asked us, how are we going to explain the very convoluted political process that we have in place to normal citizens? And we never really worried about that because we weren't about explaining things. I mean, we do have pedagogical content, and we try to be, conscious that not everyone knows what's going on. But the best way to explain things is by guiding people through the process. So it's a lot easier to understand what a bunch of people do sitting all day, like the state assembly, for instance, by going there and participating in that process than by sitting in your room reading about it. Also because no one really wants to read about it.
Right, it's like how I learned Portuguese, right? It's like I had a grammar and I had a guidebook, but really I learned
and then I put you on a plane and I dropped you into
and I couldn't, I still can't explain the future subjunctive, but I drop it into sentences.
Yes, it's very classic when you do that.
So it's back to this design brief for Mayor Rio is how do you redesign the user interface of civic participation? And it is through getting people to exercise their power collectively so that they get some sort of feedback from the system, this feedback that they weren't getting before. And so another part of storytelling are these kind of creation myths, right? How do you create a movement? How do you get people together to do stuff? And Peter Sheldall, the writer, talks about it. He was referring to artistic movements, but it really applies to what we're doing here with the political and social movements as well, right? You move to a city, you hang out in bars, form a gang, turn that into a scene, and then from that you turn into a movement. I have another presentation that I've given where I use the analogy of Ocean's 11, right? You need like different people, or like the Seventh Samurai, right? You have to get like the swordsman and then the acrobat and all of these sort of skills that you need to build a movement, as well as kind of the people to join you.
Yeah, with Maria, we actually took this advice to heart, and we started something that we call Papujiba, which it's like bar talk, I guess. And we literally go to a bar and we talk to people about things. It's not, with a lot of beer.
But this is how the American Revolution happened. This is how the Protestant Reformation happened, right? It was pubs and coffee shops. It's how you start. So we move on to the second element of a movement, which is protocols. And these are not just kind of like the rules and the norms and like looking at the laws, but it's also kind of the social software, the stuff that isn't necessarily written down, but affects our very identity and how we act. So from Mel Rio, we have our values, right? We believe that participation in itself is valuable for young people, and that will lead to better outcomes of accountability and transparency. We're nonpartisan and independent. We don't take money from the government or from political parties. We think that the internet, like I mentioned before, was that this mini school for a more robust democracy where people can exercise their collective power. And then we're also committed to sharing, right? Through open source, we value remix and reuse.
Yeah, and when we say open source, I think we're obviously referring to the code that was said previously, but we're also referring to just learnings in general. So giving that back, we have a blog where like the team just, talks about what it's like to be a team member of Rio and share some of those experiences with the public as well.
And so this is really small text, and I'm not going to go through all the details, but this is part of our internal protocols, right? How do we choose something to campaign around? Whether it's like to create a petition or to do something offline, but it has to be ripe and salient. It's in the news. It's actionable. It's not like world peace. It's like, how do you even start with that? But it's like actually something that's concrete in the city. It has some sort of political and cultural impact at the end of the day, whether you win or lose. There's some sort of comparative advantage of us talking about it rather than somebody who's already working on it. And then there's kind of the more selfish stuff, right? Does it get us earned media? Does it help grow our list, grow our members so we can become even stronger? And we can share these slides later if people want to see the details, but it's just showing some of our protocols of our internal software of how we operate.
Yes.
And then this is our tools and tactics. So how do you create and evaluate the artifacts that you design? So it's like, is it connected? Does it bring people together? Right? It's like, is it the milkshake that brings the boys to the yard? It's participatory. Does it invite people to participate? Do people want to click on it? Do they want to share it with their friends? Is it actually a user service, or is it just kind of lolcats and haha? Is it scalable? Right? Does it work for 5 people? Does it work for 5 million people? How do you change it and scale? And is it reusable? Because we care a lot about the sustainability. There's so much, another soapbox moment of like duplicated efforts and just kind of wasted money of like everybody wants their own platform as opposed to just kind of sharing it, reusing it, letting people hack it. And then there's this sort of awesome and the intangibles. Aaron and I are part of the Awesome Foundation where we try to propagate awesome in the world. And it's really about magic, right? Like I talked about religion before and how like magic and mysticism is really important in movements and bringing people together. And it's like, how can you design magic and beyond just kind of the communications part? But that's something you can quantify now. So I wrote this piece in Fast Company when I was down in Rio, talking about my experiences, what I learned about social innovation down in Brazil. And I sort of talked about Mel Rio as an institutional feijoada. It's this kind of, it's one of the national dishes of Brazil. It's this black bean dish with all the nasty bits, like the ears, the hooves, the snout, all sorts of stuff. But they make magic with it. It's like they take scarcity and they make magic with it. I think it has kind of European peasant plus slave origins to it. And how do you take these things and make something magical? But the point with Maria was like we had all of these kind of different models, institutional models, and that we tried to design something that made sense for us as people and for Rio. Where we were working, so how do you incorporate elements of online organizing, like Avaz, Get Up, All Out, some of our partner organizations at Purpose, with stuff like innovation labs, right? Whether it's the Sunlight Foundation on transparency, if it's Google on all sorts of tech innovation, or Harvard's innovation lab. How do you create a creative environment where people with different disciplinary backgrounds can create magic? And then there's like, kind of the humor side, the cultural dimensions of like culture jamming, right? The Onion, the Yes Men, Adbusters, and how do we apply all of these elements to Mill Rio?
Yes.
So then finally we get to the artifacts part,
Yes.
which, you know, some people want to go straight to the artifacts. Like how as a designer, it's like I'm a designer and I want to make the logo for this cool thing, but really we want to talk about those stories and those protocols first, because once you have that story and that protocol in place, the artifacts kind of, they don't create themselves, but it's easier because they make sense
Yes.
in that system.
So let us show you a few of our artifacts. I'll let Lucian talk about the brand first.
Okay, so we created this brand, and there was all of these kind of concerns, right? We had some high net worth individuals who were the donors. We have people from high education backgrounds, high social class backgrounds who are stakeholders, and we didn't want to alienate them, but our real target audience is young people in Class C, this emerging middle class in Brazil. We wanted to respect the local culture, but we didn't want it to be sort of tokenistic or kind of a caricature. It wasn't like a Carmen Miranda kind of identity, although Ali looks great.
I try.
So we don't want it to be elitist. We don't want it to be kind of a cartoon caricature. And we didn't want it to be, in Rio, a city that's very segregated by geography, by class. It didn't want to be like just the beach or just the big Jesus thing. It had to bring the whole city together, and one thing was like coconuts, right? Because everybody can drink coconuts, they're really cheap, they're everywhere. And the identity was inspired by these hand-painted signs of coconuts. Coconuts are things that everybody drinks, they nourish people, they hydrate people, it's hot in Rio. And then they're also kind of this imperfect form. We didn't want something that was like too modernist and too kind of a perfect circle, right? And
also, no one can really draw a perfect circle, at least I can.
Right.
So I wanted something that people could actually draw on a wall, and they wouldn't be like self-conscious about it. Like, you could just like draw a circle whatever way you can, and it looks more or less like her logo.
And even though the context was real, like I was influenced a lot by my time living in Japan and this whole like wabi-sabi imperfection thing. So I was kind of thinking about how to be like Zen about it, and how imperfection is like white space that we use in design, where the imperfection part is what gives you room for aspiration and dreams, and people can think like I can be a part of that.
And that's also, I think, it also has to do with your vision for the city. Going back to what we said before about how enlightened kind of technocrats are not necessarily the answer to a political process. You could build a perfect city in theory, but what makes cities amazing, and personally coming from Rio, what I think makes Rio really special is that it's in perfect. And that's part of the beauty of it. So we're also just making a statement in this brand around the vision, as we said before, is messy. So if we're too like obsessed with perfection, we're probably not going to allow the public to talk much, because as soon as people have room to talk, there will be discussion. There will be.
We want people to dream of something better, but it's not necessarily kind of whitewashing things, like ignoring the fact that favelas exist and that it's kind of this whitewashed touristic image for the World Cup or the Olympics. So do you want to talk about Imagine?
Yeah, sure. So,
Imagine.
Just to give you a few examples of the things, the artifacts that we've come up with along the way, this one is an interesting one. This is an interface that we designed for people to collectively ideate around public policy ideas. And we applied this in this specific case to this big effort that was being made by the federal government in Brazil. Basically what they wanted was to surface ideas from civil society on how to make government more transparent and accountable. And the way they were doing that was by organizing these conferences in major cities, and then getting all of these like crazy ideas from these cities and taking them to the state level, and then we have conferences at the state level, and then conferences at the federal level. A lot of conferences. And And in Rio, we learned about this a long time ago, because we were already kind of plugged into this process, and we registered 3 of our delegates to go. And then a week after, like a few weeks before the conference occurred, we were calling the organizers, and we asked them, so how many people have signed up? This is really exciting. And they told us that a lot of people had tried to sign up, but they only had 150 places in the conference. So we were like, okay, what are you going to do about that? Are you going to live stream it? Are people going to be able to tweet their ideas in? Like, how are we going to make sure that people who couldn't actually be there physically, because there are not enough places, or because they are working during that time, how are they going to participate? And they didn't really have an answer to that. So what we did is that we created this interface that allowed it to give an idea about how to make government more accountable and transparent, and people could do that. They could also remix other people's ideas, so it didn't really need to create something from scratch. It could just be improving upon what was already there. And our 3 delegates, instead of bringing ideas that came from Rio itself as an organization, actually brought the best, top ideas from the crowd. So we had 3 delegates advocating for 3 ideas each, the top 9, and out of the 20 ideas that got picked from the city of Rio to go to the state level conferences, 3 came from this platform. So it was very impactful in terms of the number of ideas that we could actually move forward. And it was really interesting to see the reaction of the people who were in the conference. Most of them were amazing and really interesting, but also pretty old school in terms of how they organize themselves and how they see the role of civil society. Most of them came from very well-established NGOs or neighborhood associations. And at first there was a big problem of authorship. The thing that made them uncomfortable was not necessarily the fact that we were opening up this platform. It was the fact that people could actually remix other people's ideas, so they couldn't really tell whose idea it was, and we didn't care about that. We weren't really presenting so-and-so's idea. We were presenting something that came out of the community, and they were like, well, but what about liability or responsibility? How do we know who gave this idea? And we're like, we don't. It's a product of collaboration, and that's actually what sprouted the most conversations and ignited this whole debate inside of the conference. So, one artifact, if it's well designed and if it is actually made for participation, can actually create storytelling as well, and that's how you close the loop in a way. So that's the story behind this thing.
And so this is more of a storytelling thing, even though we talked about redesigning the interface to political participation. Not everything is directed at politicians right away. So we're working with our friend, the artist and activist Feijoada, and he's going to do this documentary project where he's living on the streets for 30 days, and he'll be telling his own story and telling the stories of other people living in conditions of homelessness. And it's going to be crowdfunded. It's going to be kind of a test of our community because it's the first time we've asked our members directly for money, and it will see if they want to participate in this and see what their giving potential is, but they'll also have some ownership over this, which is important too in kind of creating dialogue in media, because the mainstream media is so monopolized in Brazil, right? It's like one family who owns everything.
So if you want to follow this, and you should, because I think it's going to be really interesting, Pais is going to the streets on the 14th of May, so in a few weeks, and he's going to be living in the streets for a month. We're giving him hidden cameras and all the other things that he needs, and we're not censoring anything, so he has all the freedom to just write about whatever he wants. I think it's going to be an interesting experiment. One thing that I would like to say about this project specifically is that, remember how we told you that we don't want conversations, we actually want action. And in this case, we didn't want conversations because, not just conversations in any case, because a lot of people who are having those conversations about conditions of homelessness have actually never even remotely experienced them, and we just felt that the conversations were kind of shallow. Even the conversations among our own staff were not necessarily connected to reality. On the other hand, we didn't want to necessarily move into action right away in this case, because we just don't understand the issue well enough. We don't know what could be done about people who live in conditions of homelessness in Rio. And instead of just trying to come up with a solution, we use our user-centric design approach to this, and we said, let's just go see what it's like and talk to people who are there.
And actually go through that process.
And we found this amazing human being who's actually a very interesting person who decided to do this and live in the streets for a month. So
here's a project for the elections. I'll go to the next page, which is the actual user interface. Basically, this is for the elections in October.
October, yes.
Right, it's an election year in Rio on the municipal level, so the mayor and the city council is up for re-election. And like we talked about before, there's kind of political propaganda everywhere, but how do you make it more participatory and less broadcast, right? The politicians get access to public money, so they can put their posters and their radio ads and their TV ads everywhere, but really, what do people actually care about? And we don't know, right? Because the mainstream media is so centralized as well. So we want people to kind of build this new interface based on the game Truth or Dare, right? And it's like asking politicians questions as if they were Truth or Dare questions. Like, do you believe that abortion should be legal? Or would you support this plan to extend the metro to my neighborhood? and sort of asking things. And we want to challenge politicians to actually answer these questions based on this crowdsourced questionnaire we make that's like the people's agenda, not just like what politicians want to talk about. And it's kind of a test too to see if politicians will actually do this. But either way, it's showing that what people care about and not necessarily what politicians want to broadcast.
Yeah, and to the point that we made earlier about, you know, movement building being about getting people to dance together to the same, you know, choreography. What we're doing here is that we're going to allow people to ask their politicians to answer this, or their candidates to answer this questionnaire that is going to be crowdsourced. But we're actually, you know, empowering a huge number of people to send emails to these candidates directly, asking them to answer. And that's how we hope to get them to do that, because we're actually coordinating action in a way that makes sense after, of course, having allowed for participation in the way we define the questionnaire in the first place. So that mix between, you know, crowdsource and just allowing everyone to give their opinion, and then, okay, guys, now it's time to act together to make sure that they actually move and answer those questions. That's what we're always like working towards with Maria.
And this is a more kind of conceptual design that's not really in active development yet, but it's really kind of to illustrate this idea of redesigning the user interface for the city, and kind of this principle of visualizing the invisible, right? It's like when you, part of the user interface of, say, paying your taxes, that you don't get a feedback loop, right? No. It's like the government likes to show off that they're doing stuff, but it's like, where do your tax dollars go? So could you see like a school, you know, does it get better funding here versus a richer neighborhood? You know, this road, how much is going into this Olympic building and whatnot? So it's just this idea of visualizing things, and maybe it's through smartphones, maybe it's through something else, but it's just a way that we can think about stuff and kind of dream about the future.
Annotating the city in a way, right? Just making notes all over it and making sure that people can engage with them. We talked about like an audio tour for this as well, because more phones are not yet a significant part of the market in Brazil,
right. And they get stolen like your phone.
And they get stolen. So we thought about an audio tour where we just can call in a number and hear something about that place.
And also just tell stories as well.
We're exploring that right now. So if you have ideas.
That was kind of the more techie side of things, but really kind of wanted to bring it back to these artifacts that are really like old school for designers. I mean, we talked about pixels, but sometimes it's just designing stuff with paint, like this banner that people can actually use in real life. And I'll kind of show some more pictures of our members kind of protesting and making their opinions known. This is around a campaign for education and fully funding education, so it gets 25% of the revenue.
The city budget, which is what it should be according to Brazilian Constitution. We lost this campaign, by the way. Rio keeps not respecting the Brazilian Constitution, not actually putting the funds that it should on education. But what this did, which was really interesting, is that it sparked a whole lot of debate around, you know, whether funding is even the biggest problem with public education in Brazil. And what we would do with the money if we did get the money. What's the main priority? Should we raise teacher salaries? Should we build more schools? What do we do with that? So all of those tangential debates are actually, you know, not tangential at all, pretty central to this problem, were ignited by this mobilization. And even though we lost, I didn't feel it as a loss in many ways.
And it brought people offline, right? It addresses all these critiques of like slacktivism, right? It's not just about the app or the website, is that because we're dealing with one city that's concrete, like people can actually show up and do stuff. You know, we also did this thing where we brought school kids to the city assembly, to the vote and stuff like that. And so we're working, you know, instead of thinking about like online and offline, it's this kind of integrated system.
Yeah, it was like we had 75 school kids come to the vote. They registered on our website like their parents did, and we had like to sign all these liability forms, and they all came with us to the vote. It was like this crazy volunteer operation with people picking the kids up in school and bringing them. And I think the city legislators had never seen kids in there ever before, so it was a lot of fun.
And so just to kind of sum up the elements of a movement, we had storytelling, right? What is the crisis? What is the problem? What is the kind of creation story? How do we make sense of the world? And then there's the protocols, our operating software, both of kind of these tools that we create in software, but also our social software. What do we believe in? Our rules of engagement. And then finally, we get to the artifacts as part of this whole system, right? Create social objects, whether they're made out of paint or pixels, that invite people to participate. And so that was the end, and we're happy to take questions if we have time.
Yeah, we have some questions.
Okay.
So Marissa Feinberg says, Purpose creates software anyone can use and access to create movements. Amazing. Where can we download it?
So Purpose doesn't create software as a service just yet. I think it's something that we could do in the future. For Murillo, what we've been working with Murillo specifically is open source. So what it means is that you could go to our GitHub account and download the source code. It's not software that you can download per se. It's not usable yet. So you would need a programmer to make sense out of that code. But it's it's worked on already, and it's very well documented. It's on GitHub. I can actually, I don't know how we would be able to talk to you again, but I'm sure Aaron will find a way for us to do that. And I can give you the exact URL, but it's the Murillo account on GitHub. So if you search for Murillo and GitHub, you will definitely find that. Another thing is that Murillo is actually now building software that would be downloadable in the way that you described. So not just the code being available, but the software itself being available to other organizations that want to create their own campaigns. So
and actually, Imagine was actually based on a previous open source project. So it had already built on something else. And unfortunately, with sort of purpose as the umbrella, GitHub, we work with partners who are unfortunately less likely to share than Murillo and don't necessarily have those values, and for whatever reason they don't put everything on GitHub. So it really depends on the project.
Murillo is entirely there, and the software that you can download thing should be available in the next couple of months. So please stay tuned. You can find more information on our blog, and we're always blogging about what we're doing. So that's definitely going to come soon.
If you read Portuguese.
If you read Portuguese, or if you have Google Translate.
Yeah.
So
Perfect. So we have another question from Asia Palacios, and she says, "Is going to the source considered a human-centered approach?" I think this is referring to earlier slides that you were showing.
Going to the source in terms of actually talking to people who have real need, or like what?
I'm assuming that's what she's referring to, going to the source, being in the communities.
Human-centric approach. Can you talk about the user-centric design?
I kind of did that brief overview of, like, say, the identity, but we talked to all sorts of people, from like famous think tank people and authors to people to like kids living in favelas, and just kind of listened to them. We went and observed how people lived and asked their things. But part of the systems that we're creating is where people can have their own voice, right? It's like part of it is just listening to people, observing people. Is this
just saying regarding the documentary? So regarding Página Pista, yes. I mean, we didn't overthink it in this case. We weren't like, oh my God, is this human-centric, whatever. Like we were basically mapping out themes that we wanted to address, things that we thought were big unspoken themes in the city where people's voices weren't being heard. And policy for homeless, for people in situations of homelessness is definitely an example of that, because we're formulating all of these policies without necessarily knowing what people who are living through this reality actually think and want and know, and what their experience could bring to the table. So, but at the same time, we don't live through this reality either. So it's very different from other things that Murillo has addressed in the past, like public transportation or education, in which every citizen of the city really has had an experience with education or transportation in their lives. With homelessness, it's not the case. So we felt that we weren't placed to host that debate either, and we'll just be repeating the same mistakes that we are finding in government and other institutions. So in order to avoid that, we decided that the only way of approaching that would be to actually go live it.
And I'm sure the approach will be controversial to people, but that's why we want to crowdfund it, to test, to see if other people agree with this approach. And we don't know what we don't know, so it's part of it.
We really don't know what we don't know. So Pais is also not just kind of parachuting in the streets. He has come to Rio. He's an Argentinian citizen. He has been living in Brazil for 2 years, and he has actually spent a lot of time in the streets already when he first arrived in Rio, penniless. So he has a lot of friends already. He has like all these networks. So he's also someone who's like interesting because he's in between these different worlds.
It's not like a poverty tourism kind of situation.
No.
So we have another question from Asia, and she wants to know, are politicians participating in this platform?
So it's really interesting. Like our Facebook group, if you check that out, has a bunch of city councilmen who post on it regularly now. So when they have like something to talk about, they post on their group.
They show up to our events, and they want to get on speeches. So they bring their own cameraman. I mean, they want to be seen as like hip and cool with the kids.
It's really cool. So in that regards, yes. I've also spoken to the mayor twice since we launched, and that was 6 months ago. So there's definitely a response on the institutional side, even though it's been a little bit more difficult with the city to get real engagement, and I think that's normal. If you're being disruptive, you're bound to just create some discomfort. But I can't say they've been irresponsive or not paying attention. We launched a campaign a few weeks ago that was about getting the candidates for mayor to commit not to take money from companies that have been convicted for fraud and corruption, which sounds straightforward, but they weren't.
Apparently it's not illegal.
Apparently it's not illegal, so they weren't doing that, and all of the candidates had replied except for the mayor. So we sent him a letter and we're like, hey, please reply, and he did. He actually, one of his assistants called us today, so they were proactive about it, which is really good, and told us that he cannot actually sign it right now because he's not doing any campaigning stuff apparently right now, but he will go back to it in June when he will be doing more campaigning actively. So we'll follow up on that, but that's just to show that there is definitely a real dialogue there.
So we have a bunch of questions, and I'm not sure we're going to get to all of them.
Sure.
But
Sorry,
what we'll
guys.
do is, for some of them, we can, if you want to email directly to dsiinfo@sva.edu, we can try and direct some of these questions maybe later to Ali and Sean.
Yeah.
We might have to do this one as our last one based on time.
Sure.
But Chris Burley is asking, do you perceive community participation and involvement as essential for their commitment to the movement?
Yes. The short answer is yes. We'll let LeSean elaborate.
And part of it was that commitment curve that we showed, right? That it's we don't draw this line in the sand you're a member if you donate, and we don't have membership cards, or you don't have to make your pledge of allegiance to Rio. It's really this low barrier thing where it's you're part of our community if you get our emails or you like us on Facebook or you follow us on Twitter. And obviously it's a smaller group of people who show up to the live events. But it's this loose idea of community and organization that helps us cast a wide net.
And there's always it's a two-way street. So we're trying to build a community of our own. So we're trying to get people to join that community, but we're also trying to be accepted in an existing community. Rio is not the first organization in Rio that is trying to work on social change or get people involved in politics. We do that in a pretty unique way, but we're not the first ones to be doing that. That would be very pretentious for us to say. So we're also trying to be part of that community. And unless we are open to conversation and dialogue, we're never going to be able to do that. So I would say that harder than getting people to join our community is making sure that we join theirs. I don't know if that makes sense.
Right, and people are part of different communities and have different identities.
Yeah. Okay.
So we have a bunch of really amazing questions that we would love to answer at some point. And Ali and LeSean are obviously faculty members with DSI and will be teaching a class this fall covering a lot of these topics. This is sort of a really high-level overview, and we understand that because of that, there's going to be a lot of questions. So definitely feel free to email dsiinfo@sva.edu, and we'll try and get you answers to these questions. And we can post them on the webpage.
Sounds great.
Absolutely.
Looking forward to it.
Also, if you have questions for Mario takes questions. So you can email anyone in our team. It could be me. You can find all of our email addresses on our website. And you can feel free to email in English if you want, and we will be pleased to answer it. So.
Yeah. And our next webinar is going to be next Tuesday, 6 p.m. It's going to be with Julie Manga on staying grounded in the swirl. And she'll be talking about, as your life gets busier, how to really keep yourself centered and be focusing on what matters.
Wow,
I know, it's a good one.
All right. Great. Thank you, everybody, for participating.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye.